Your next author, like Bobby Jabowski and Carl Weidman, has been with us since the beginning. He's extremely famous for his mystery novels. The real mystery is how his books sell. A self-proclaimed maestro of murder, please welcome to the podium Sir Reginald Archibald Gladstone III.
Good evening. I did not abandon my lush country estate to speak to a room filled with reprobates, only to be ignored. Let's try this again. Good evening.
Good evening.
Here's to me. Yes, I am in fact Sir Reginald Archibald Gladstone III. No doubt you've seen my visage on the backs of my many Inspector Jerry Gerard murder mystery novels. Inspector Gerard is a bit of a spirit animal, I suppose. His keen brilliance can only be expressed by yours truly on the written page. I suppose you could say he's an avatar of mine. How many of you are familiar with the Inspector Jerry Gerard murder mystery novels? To my help. Those of you who are not familiar, perhaps you have heard these titles by the water cooler, as it were. Death by Edwardian Hospitality. Why are the butler's gloves at the crime scene? My third book, The Maid Man. My fourth, that thrilling courtroom drama, The Wrong Man is on Trial, and that man is not the butler. I'm proud to announce that I am in a near-Broadway one-man courtroom drama entitled One Angry Man. Next time you leave your shanty town, you should culture yourselves. Here's to me. I've been asked to appear here tonight to edify you. No doubt many of you are aspiring murder mystery writers. So I have come up with a list following Miss Chandler's model. 10 tips to composing the perfect murder mystery. Number 1. In mystery writing, there should always be a murder. It is important that the reader understand that the sleuth in a murder mystery is so much more intelligent than they are. Let's face it, if you were a brilliant detective, you wouldn't spend your time reading murder mystery novels. Number 3, introduce the crime early in the book. That way, the rest of the book can be used to fill with plenty of clues to help the reader and detective solve the crime. It is important that the case is solved by the end of the book. Because once the murder is solved, then that's the end of the plot. Number 4, the crime should be sufficiently violent, preferably a murder. Number 5, the crime should be believable. That is, take place on Earth and preferably in an English-speaking part. Otherwise, you'll lose a lot of readers who can only read English. Number 6, every murder mystery has these 3 elements: a murderer, a location, such as a ballroom, or a conservatory, or a study. And a murder weapon could be a rope or candlestick, lead pipe or wrench. I prefer the knife, myself and my mysteries. Number 6, the culprit must be capable of committing the crime, but there should be enough doubt to prevent the reader to discover who the murderer is before the brilliant detective explains it all in the end. Number 8, whenever writing about your sleuth, make sure that they happen to be attending an event or are serendipitously related to the murderer in some way. This will ensure that the sleuth will be involved. I mean, why would a nosy old bat ask a bunch of questions about a murder unless she happened to be at the same masquerade ball? Classic Angela Lansbury. Your giddiness evades me. Number 9, do your research. All my murder mysteries take place in opulent country estates, because that is where I have spent most of my life. I know affluence, but by the looks of some of you, you may want to stick to writing a gritty dime novel that takes place in whatever slum you're most familiar with. Number 10, critics have recommended that I put a twist at the end of my murder mysteries, but personally, I find their obsession with American dance confounding. I assure you, death is not a laughing matter. And now an excerpt from my latest work. Was it the butler? By Sir Reginald Archibald Gladstone III, starring Inspector Cherry Gerard. Mrs. Vanderwall took the dirty-handled garden rake in her silk-gloved hand and nodded. "Thank you, Inspector Gerard, for returning my garden rake. You are a true gentleman. This evening, the butler has provided a delicious meal, herrings in tomato sauce. Will you and the Mrs. Gerard like to join us?" I appreciate the offer, but I don't care for red herrings. And you know very well that there is no Mrs. Gerard, Mrs. Vanderwall. Mrs. Vanderwall blushed. "Yes, well, how could I have forgotten? It's just that Mr. Vanderwall hasn't been around much. I'm beginning to feel like a widow." The inspector's eyes sharpened. "What does he do with his time?" "Oh," replied Mrs. Vanderwall, "he mostly argues with the butler over something about a lot of money that he owes him, and that he will pay the butler over his dead body. One evening, I heard the two men yelling. I heard one of them say, 'I'm going to kill you!'" "Who said it?" inquired the ever-calculating inspector. "I'm not sure. I think it was the butler, but it could have been my husband. I guess we'll never know." "Will you be staying for tea, Inspector Gerard?" asked Mrs. Vanderwall. The inspector quickly responded. "I deduced you would ask me that very question, Mrs. Vanderwall." "Oh, Inspector, however do you do it?" "Not everyone was born with a gift such as I. Now then, I assume we shall sup for tea in the parlor?" "Why, yes." cried Mrs. Vanderwall with justified surprise. "You've done it again, Inspector." The wealthy aristocrat leaned the dirty garden rake against the banister and rang for the butler. But he did not arrive. Inspector Gerard studied Mrs. Vanderwall in the study, and a confused look crept across her face while they waited for the butler to arrive, which he did not. A scream was heard in the parlor, and Inspector Gerard leapt into action. He quickly drew his magnifying glass and dashed into the parlor with the fierceness of a Bengal tiger. There, in the parlor, Mr. Vanderwall fell to the floor as the butler stood there. The butler had a butcher knife in his hand, and it was bloody, or perhaps it was just tomato sauce. Mrs. Vanderwall shrieked like any typical woman would. Inspector Gerard said, "I deduce that this is now the scene of a murder." Mr. Vanderwall raised a bloody hand, or perhaps it was just tomato sauce, and pointed at the butler. He mumbled something like, "The butler killed me." And his arm fell as he stopped moving. The butler quickly covered the body with a sheet. Mrs. Vanderwall asked, "Oh, dear Inspector, what do we do now?" "I shall have to use my brilliant detective skills to deduce who the murderer is. Butler, it seems to me that you have a knife in your hands. And so I deduce that you found the murder weapon. Is that correct?" "I don't know," said the butler. He put the knife in a tureen of tomato soup. The inspector, considering all possibilities, deduced, yes, well, perhaps it was just tomato sauce. "Yes," said the butler. "I was just telling Mr. Vanderwall a joke." "Can you confirm that, butler?" asked the inspector, his genius and acumen cutting to the truth. "Well, you heard Mr. Vanderwall say it himself. I killed him." "Oh, I see," said the inspector. "It must have been a terribly funny joke. Please do tell." "Well, it goes like so. There are two goldfish in a tank. One goldfish turns to the other and asks, 'Good sir, have you any recollection on how to operate this mechanism?' As he finished, Mrs. Vanderwall and the inspector agreed that the jest was indeed terribly funny. I shall read no more. I don't want to ruin the ending for you. I'm sure it was nice to meet me. Thank you. You're welcome.